Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today it is time to look at the ground suggestions for the pasta developers for June of 2022. There's some interesting machines here, some of them more interesting than others, but I do have a quick PSA before we get into this stuff. If you are going to create something which is designed for pasta developers, please get somebody to proofread your work. Some of this stuff is impossible to read. The language is broken. There is a lot of spelling mistakes and also just wrong words used in a lot of places. So if you can imagine a person like me who is a fluent English speaker trying to understand this, imagine somebody who isn't as fluent trying to understand this. This set of pasta developers is probably the poorest I've ever seen when it comes to punctuation and when it comes to spelling mistakes and when it comes to just general reading. Just get somebody to proofread your stuff, please. It's not hard to do and it would be so much better than what this represents. The first vehicle is for Germany, and it is the Jagdtiger P, at least named the Jagdtiger P. There were only two confirmed Jagdtiger variants that ever existed. A lot of people have talked about the 88mm version of the vehicle, and then obviously stuff like the 105, if that existed, and then of course the 128, which is the one that we actually have. But this one actually focuses on something different, the suspension base of the vehicle itself. Basically, you had the standard Jagdtiger, which we have in game. This has the standard Henschel 9-wheel overlapping road wheel setup, but approximately the first 11 Jagdtigers made actually had a different suspension type, which was the 8-wheeled Porsche-designed Tiger suspension. These were replaced by the Henschel suspension ones in production after proving troublesome. Thus, out of the 70 or 80 or so Jagdtigers produced, the first 11 only had this type of suspension. So basically, it would be a slightly different suspension. Also, technically, it should have Zimmerit paste, where the Jagdtiger that we have in game does not have Zimmerit paste. Generally, if you have a look at those things, those would be the differences. It should have the same engine, the Maybach HL230P30, and then also the same gun, the 128mm, so nothing there would change. Maybe this would be an event vehicle, or maybe just in the standard tech tree. The next vehicle is the T-3485M. This was a set of prototype vehicles made in the Second World War, obviously based off the T-34. The development of this new T-34 started on the 28th of May 1944, after an order from the People's Commissar of Tank Production and the Commander of the Mechanized and Armed Forces ordered a modernization of the T-3485. There was two variants of the prototype built. The first was a regular T-3485. It had thicker upper hull armor, and the second was a completely new tank with stronger frontal slope on it and also larger internal fuel tanks in the rear. Both of these T-34s were tested on over 1,200 kilometers, and a third regular T-3485 was also tested to use kind of as a standard for the test. The trials were done at Kubinka, and also done between the 24th of May to the 10th of June 1944. All the tests were performed as any other tank except for the off-road maneuverability, which was done on a destroyed dirt road. The main improvement of both of these tanks was, of course, the armor values that they would have. The tank wasn't heavier from the thicker armor because it didn't have more armor technically. What it had was more angled armor or more armor in different areas. Some places had less armor, some places had more armor. For example, the roof and bottom armor was reduced by 5mm and the rear lower plate was reduced by 15mm. The tank would have been a bit more vulnerable to mine and aerial attack, but by those times of its conception, the Germans had already lost the superiority war for good. So generally they took, certain weights from certain areas of the vehicle and put them on different areas, mainly taking them from the top and the bottom and adding them to the front. The tests on the tank armor were conducted with a Panther gun, and as a result of the tests, the gun could only penetrate the armor at a distance of 650 meters or less. There was a bit of a serial flaw, though, which was noted in the T-3485M. There was the amounts of them There was a lot of low reliability on the smaller driving socket that they used, and the suspension in general. The heavier machine gun shield was also making it less durable, and the fuel tanks on the second variant were making the access to the transmission much harder and required the entire fuel tanks to be removed in order to get access to the transmission. So therefore there was a bunch of ideas which needed to go through in order for the development of the T3485M to go through, but instead it was cancelled in favor of the T44, which started its trials, and also because it was basically the end of the war at that point. They had no need for this vehicle. So the general thing with the T3485M, what you'd have is the standard 85, but it would have slightly different armor compared to the standard T3485. The Japanese get a wonky vehicle, which looks very similar to a Priest. This is the Type 56 105mm SPG, the SY. This was a post-World War II vehicle, and in 1954, the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force was created, of course. However, all of their equipment at the time was towed, hindering their ability. This is obviously talking about mainly their artillery pieces. As such, the first vehicle that they designed was something that could carry the weapons they had at the time, and this vehicle was the Type 56 105mm self-propelled gun. It was designated the SY, which followed the naming convention of the JGSDF, used between the 50s and the 70s for tracked prototype vehicles. The S stood for Soki, which meant tracked, and the Y signified which project the prototype was part of. The SY's design was strongly influenced by the American M37 self-propelled gun. Both were SPGs based on the chassis of the M24 Chaffee, which used the American M2A1 105mm howitzer. Both also had an M2 Browning 50 cal machine gun placed at the front of the vehicle. The main difference between them was that the SY had a fully enclosed fighting compartment, which would better help protect the crew. Another difference was the gun mounted around the 105mm howitzer. While this let the SY retain the same accuracy and the rate of fire as the original howitzer, the elevation was limited to only 35 degrees, which was very low for an SPG. The SY was also slightly smaller than the M37 when it came to its dimensions. The main reason that the Japanese decided to develop the SY as opposed to getting the M37 sent over from America was concerns about its mobility. The M37, despite sharing the same chassis and engine as the Chaffee, was more sluggish due to its increased weight. The goal of the SY was to have an SPG that had the same mobility that the Chaffee had, and as such, the SY had a modified transmission and a Mitsubishi diesel engine with 230 horsepower, slightly less to the Chaffee's twin petrol Cadillac engine with 296 total horsepower. The worst power-to-weight ratio was supposed to be compensated with the 115 TC MS200 transmission with a torque converter on it. The design of the vehicle was finalized in 1957, and the first prototype was completed in January of 1958. Pitching tests were held in Misaka Pass, and sand mobility tests were held on the coast of Chigasaki. And these first revealed that the diesel engine overheated, and so the SY was sent back to get it fixed. The following trials and examinations were conducted the next year, with the resulting mileage exceeding 6,000 kilometers. It was found that the 115 TC MS200 transmission had a very poor performance when the engine was at low torque. This led to the transmission getting replaced with a hydromatic automatic transmission, as well as further modifications to the auxiliary transmission. Even with these modifications, the project ended up getting cancelled, and the JGSDF ended up adopting the M44 and also M52 self-propelled guns instead. The next self-propelled gun that the JGSDF developed was the Type 74 105mm SPG, which started in 1967, which we've had a look at before. So unfortunately this one never really went anywhere, but it was fully built and tested, which is pretty cool. The Chinese get the VT4, which is an export tank made by Norinco, designed, of course, for other nations than China. This vehicle is actually used by other nations right now, including the Royal Thai Army, which is pretty cool. Nigeria and Pakistan also have some orders for the VT4 itself. The VT4 actually has access to the standard 125mm smoothbore gun, complemented by two machine guns, one 12.7mm and one 7.62, which is mounted on the roof and also coaxially for the 7.62. The ammunition fired by the main gun is all of the standard stuff, including HESH, funnily enough, but it also can fire ATGMs, the 9K119M Reflex. The gun is fully stabilized, it has the automatic loader, now obviously it's a Chinese vehicle, and also has third generation thermal imaging, supposedly. The vehicle's main gun has the carousel type autoloader, which is similar to the other Chinese MBTs that you see at the top tier of the game, and it holds 22 rounds, so basically exactly the same as the T-72 one that we have when it comes to the game. The protection of the vehicle, it has access to some of the more powerful ERA, so it has access to the FY4 ERA with an option for the FY2SH ERA blocks mounted on the side skirts. The turret also has a wedge-shaped armor, and overall the vehicle likely has similar protection to the ZTZ-99 series, but of course, since it's classified, we have absolutely no idea how useful it is, and it probably is slightly worse than the standard MBTs that you find in the Chinese ranks, just because it's an export vehicle. But it is, of course, very hard to know this, because once again, it is, of course, classified. When it comes to the mobility, the vehicle itself has access to a 1200 horsepower turbocharged diesel engine. This means that it can get up to 67 to 70 kilometers an hour, also has a maximum range of 500 kilometers. The suspension is a torsion bar suspension, but the vehicle also has an integrated hydraulic transmission system on it, so while driving and moving is done by an automatic gear transmission on the vehicle. The engine, sometimes referred to as the Type 150, is thought to be an uprated British Perkins CV12-1200 TCA engine, which is used on the Challenger 1 and also the Challenger 2 tanks, but the engine itself is produced in China. It also has a bunch of other features since it's a modern tank. It has a laser rangefinder, GPS, panoramic sight, hunter-killer capabilities, an IFF system, NBC protection, explosion suppression system, fire extinguishing system, and of course air conditioning for the crew as well. The Italians get the 102-35 Su Fiat 634N. This was an emergency gun truck which was developed by the Italian army during the North African campaign. There were 7 of them produced in total. The vehicle itself mounted the 102mm, the Model 1914 cannon, taken from the Benghazi defensive battery and put onto Fiat 634 trucks, the largest truck available to Italian forces at the time. These cannons had served as the primary armaments of Italian destroyers and also as deck guns on Italian submarines during and after the First World War, and after their retirement from naval service had been repurposed as anti-air guns. The trucks were designed for multi-purpose. It was hoped that they would be effective tank destroyers, support artillery, and also mobile anti-aircraft guns. According to accounts, the vehicles performed well in all of these roles. In the first battle of Bir el Gubi, a group of 5 102-35 Su Fiat 634N trucks destroyed 15 British tanks from long range. However, it was still an emergency design and was plagued with multiple problems as a result of this, including a complete lack of armor, a gun shield, or even crew protection, a high profile, poor off-road performance, and also poor reliability. None survived the North African campaign, although one was captured by the British and also photographed. The French get an AMX-30, but this is a special AMX-30. It is the AMX-30B SAMM, and its life starts in 1968, where the French army was posed with a technical dilemma. Despite being developed just 5 years earlier as part of the failed Europanzer project, the AMX-30 was beginning to show its age in light of its allied counterparts. The tank was well-rounded in its general mobility, mechanical reliability, and also gun handling, but the absence of composite armor meant that the need for a high first-shot, first-hit probability was in serious consideration. Army technicians examined multiple solutions to the issue, including the design of a modern fire control system and also gun stabilizer. Expertise from the private sector was also received, and in response, French defense firm SAMM developed its own proposal. SAMM had previously done work with the Swiss armed forces in regards to the Panzer 61, retrofitting a single model with a two-plane stabilizer with satisfactory results. Work on the AMX-30 began in 1968 and was completed sometime in the same year. In addition to the two-plane stabilizer, a TCV-15 laser rangefinder made by the General Electric Company was installed. Similar results were obtained with the AMX-30B, however, by this time the French army declined to take further actions, citing cuts in the defense budget. So basically, this is an AMX-30B, which actually has access to a stabilizer. The Israelis get the M3 TCM-20, which is of course an AA truck once again, and this was originally a conversion of the M2 Scout car. The M3 Halftrack quickly turned into the US Army's armored personnel carrier of choice for armored infantry regiments. Naturally, it was exported to the Allies too, and a number of other nations. But after the war ended, the single largest user of the M3 Halftrack was Israel. Israeli agents secretly bought a number of Halftracks in Europe following the war and shipped them to Israel. As a matter of fact, some of the very first armored vehicles Israel used were the M3 Halftracks and its variants, mostly the M5 and also the M9, painted red to disguise them as agricultural equipment. Israel often up-armored and up-gunned these vehicles. Some fitted 20mm cannons in place of the 12.7mm M2 machine guns, others were fitted with 6-pounder anti-tank guns. In the initial fighting in 1948, about 20 were in service with the Haganah and then the Israeli Defense Forces. After Israel was established, Italy eventually sold Israel about 150 demilitarized half-tracks, including M4 mortar carriers, as well as M14 and M15 MGMCs. All of these would have rear doors added in order to make way for standardization. M3 and M5 half-tracks would be used as troop carriers, mortar carriers, and also command carriers. After the 1956 Suez Crisis, Israel received from France and various European scrap dealers more half-tracks, in which two anti-tank variants were developed. One mounted a Belgian 90mm Makar anti-tank gun, while the other had a closed top and was fitted with the French Nord Aviation SS-11 wire-guided anti-tank missiles. Obviously, that is the Zaklam Tega. In the 1960s, General Avraham Adan tried to purchase M113 APCs to replace the aging half-tracks, but this was resisted by the famous General Israeli Tal, then head of the armored forces, who felt the half-tracks to be adequate given Israelis' limited budget. In the end, though, General Adan won, and Israel would use the M113 APCs in the 1973 war for its frontline units. Slowly over time, these would replace the half-tracks, although quite a few were kept for special purposes, including command vehicles, air defense, and for engineer and maintenance units. Around the late 1960s, Israel had begun to employ a modified version of the M55 quad mount named the TCM-20, the former of which, some of which came with half-tracks provided previously. This version featured two Hispano HS-404 autocannons, and previously the Israeli Defense Force used the M55 quad mount, which used the 12.7mm M2 machine guns. But in the age of jets, dealing damage to a target and being able to reach it was important, which is why the switch to 20mm cannons was made. Each gun had a cyclic rate of 650 to 700 rounds per minute, and the feed from 60-round drums, which can be replaced quickly. The horizontal and vertical guidance was electrically driven, powered by a 12-volt battery mounted at the rear of the bogie, which is recharged by an auxiliary motor. The TCM-20 was put into service just before the War of Attrition in 1970, and in 10 battles is thought to have shot down 10 aircraft. In the Yom Kippur War, it is believed to be responsible for 60% of the aircraft shot down by air defenses, as well as performing excellently at holding the bridges at the Suez Canal. Owing to its origin as a vehicle mount, the TCM-20 was easily mounted into various vehicles the IDF had, such as the BTR-40 and the M3 half-track. During the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, IDF TCM-20 crews not only had downed aircraft, but also found the dual guns useful for firing at ground targets. Eventually, it began to be sold for export and is currently used by 6 countries. However, as time went on, the IDF switched over to the Hovet, the Israeli name for the M163 VADS. Currently, one example of the M3 Halftrack with the TCM-20 exists at the Israeli Air Museum at Hadzerim Air Base. The Finnish get another suggestion, and this is a T-34-85, but instead of having access to the standard 85mm, it has access to the 75mm AT gun that you find off the Stug 3 for the Germans. Basically, the idea was in 1945, during the war, the Finnish were running out of ammunition for the 85mm from the Soviets. So what they decided to do was to try a prototype of a T-34, which installed the 75mm gun, the PSV K40, which they named this, which was the 7.5cm Stug 40 L48. This would basically mean that it would be much easier to be able to, use the gun since they actually had ammunition for it. But in the post-World War era, or the post-Second World War era, I should say, the Finnish army wasn't too keen on experimental vehicles, so they basically dropped it after having the 75mm installed. The idea was not really pursued, so it was kind of just left there. But at the end of the day, what this is a T-34-85 with a 75mm, which would be kind of interesting. Obviously, the breech is different, and the gun itself is different as well. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Nicholas Richardson, Elove Goat, Pyman675, Winter Scientist, Merciless Reaper, Jerry Prevolt, Megadino King, Orange Tail, Teddy, John Ryman, Universe, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Moxie, B. Young, Uncle Bean, Sem Arslan, Derek R., Bareen, Lafouche, and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.